Greetings sailors and welcome to a review of HMAS Perth, and this one has really been quite a long time coming in a way, because I was actually given this to preview way back when it first came out towards the end of last year. I think it was November 2016, something like that. Now my memory is that it came alongside some other thing. It was either the IJN destroyer split or it might have been the German destroyers, but they put it out alongside a major branch or a major split of an existing branch, and so it kind of fell by the wayside because I only had so much time, and as it was only a tier 6 cruiser, I thought, okay, it's not that interesting, I'll just concentrate on the other thing. And in hindsight, that's a bit of a mistake, because actually Perth's a pretty good ship. It's quite a fun tier 6 premium. Now it is a tier 6 premium, so therefore it will get down tiered quite a lot these days, unfortunately, but Perth can maybe cope with it better than some of the others, and that's because it has a very particular trick which undoubtedly you're already aware of, but if not, well, we'll save that till after I've talked about the stats. Now, Perth's not been on sale for a little while, I don't think. I can't remember when the last time it was in the shop, but it's one of those premiums that you can pick up from a super container, which is actually how I got mine. And so therefore, even though it might seem a bit strange that I'm doing a review video on a ship you can't actually buy at the moment, it's still a ship you can theoretically get at basically any time. So what it is a Commonwealth Leander, and it's I say Commonwealth because it was actually the Royal Australian Navy, but they've put in a separate Commonwealth nation in the game, so you can't use your Royal Navy commanders on it, unfortunately. This is one of those premiums where you've got to train up your own commander from scratch, essentially, which is a slight downside, but if you do get it from a super container, generally they come with a 10-point captain at least, which is quite nice. It's actually better than you'd get if you were buying most premiums from the shop. There are some differences from the Leander though, and as an interesting little tidbit, when I was looking up the page on Wikipedia, don't judge me, yeah, it basically did start off as a Royal Navy Leander class ship, but it was a modified Leander. There were a group of 3 modified Leanders, all of which ended up with the Royal Australian Navy, and one of them I had already heard of. I'm not quite sure why they picked Perth to be in the game, but one of the others, HMAS Sydney, is actually reasonably famous for its mutually destructive final battle with a German commerce raider called the Cormoran. And I'd heard of that ship and that engagement long before World of Warships was a thing. So it's a little unusual that they didn't put in Sydney, but maybe they will at some point. Although having 2 basically, you know, Leander class cruisers on the Commonwealth tree might be a bit, I don't know. If they had a regular Commonwealth cruiser branch at some point, but then that would be mostly copies of Royal Navy ships, so I don't think that would work either. So yeah, I don't know why they chose Perth rather than Sydney, but there it is. Perth itself did have a reasonably active service life. Let's see, it was transferred to the Royal Australian Navy in 1939, took part in various patrols and engagements in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean. It was involved in the Battle of Greece and the Battle of Crete, in the Syria-Lebanon campaign, and then returned to Australia in 1941. But unfortunately, even though it survived the Battle of the Java Sea, it was then sunk at the Battle of the Sunda Strait in early 1942. So it did not survive the war, and of course Sydney didn't either. The only one of that group that did was HMAS Hobart, which made it all the way to 1962. So before we get on to the gimmick of the Perth, first off I will run down the stats, which won't take me that long because it's basically a Leander. There's not that much different about it. There's a couple of little variations, 1 or 2 things where it's slightly worse, 1 or 2 things where it's slightly better, but the big difference really is in the consumables on this thing. That's where it really does differ in playstyle. It just goes to show you what a difference having different consumables on essentially the same ship can actually make. So, hit points, 27,100, not good for tier 6. There are a couple of ships that are around the 27,000 mark. The Legalos on the air, and the Nuremberg are both around about that. One's slightly better, one's slightly worse, but most ships have better than that. Leander itself's got 28,700. There are some that are over 30,000 hit points, so you can't stand to take many hits, and even less so than the Leander because you don't have a heal, so you almost have to be more cautious than the Leander. You know, you can take the same amount of damage, but you have no ability to get any health back whatsoever. Armour, I'm not even going to look at armour at the end of the video, but it's basically the same as the Leander. It will eat citadels for days, so you really do have to be careful about what's shooting at you. Take the not expert marksman, that's the turret traverse skill. The one that tells you how many people are aiming at you, that's definitely a must for this ship. I mean, it is for most cruisers anyway, but you know, just in case you were thinking of not taking it, don't. It's not worth it. You absolutely you benefit hugely from knowing how many people are pointing their guns at you at any one time, is what I'm trying to ham-fistedly say there. Main armament, basically the same 6-inch guns with exactly the same turret traverse of 25.7. The only difference here is that the range is worse than the Leander. It gets a really quite anemic 12.8 kilometers, which is by far the worst at this tier. In fact, that would be not that good at tier 5 and maybe more or less normal at tier 4. So yeah, Perth was already Leander rather was already struggling for range, and Perth is even more so. So I almost consider the spotter to be essential equipment on this. You can use a catapult fighter instead, but you're going to want that spotter plane. I should note, by the way, for this first replay, I'm using both the spotter and the smoke mod. So I've got extra duration on both. The default smoke time is, I think, 90 seconds, but with the smoke mod, it's almost 2 minutes. And the spotter, I can't even remember. But either way, yeah, the extra time on the spotter is very, very useful. The biggest change with the guns overall is the fact that you get HE, but you also don't have the Royal Navy cruiser semi-armor piercing AP shells. Well, that was slightly redundant, but anyway, you know what I mean. You don't have the SAP, and so it pretty much relegates you to doing what you mostly do with the tier 6-inch gunned cruisers that have HE. You fire a lot of it, especially as you'll be getting matchmaking like this quite a lot. I picked this game out because it was a pretty average game. It was nothing really special, and just kind of showed me being sneaky, using the smoke where I could, firing a lot of HE. If you get broadside cruisers, or maybe if you're closer to a battleship and they're not pointing their guns at you, AP can be workable. But yeah, no, you're going to be using a lot of HE, and I think therefore IFHE is probably quite a good skill on this ship as well. At least, you know, it is at the moment. It depends what changes they make to it in the future. Let's see. Secondaries, it's exactly the same. 4-inch guns, I want to say. It's 4 twin mount 102mm guns with 5-kilometer range. On the Leander, that is literally the only way to set a fire, but of course it's not so much the case on this ship. Oh, I didn't mention the fire chance, actually. That's the thing. 9% fire chance on the main battery, which is actually also still not that good. It's quite anemic. It's 1% better than the Nuremberg, but yeah, 9% is not that good for its tier. Anyway, so yeah, the secondaries aren't much cop, but occasionally you might get a hilarious secondary kill, which is always amusing when you manage a close quarters in a cruiser. I've got one in a Krasny Krim, which is up on the channel somewhere, which was very, very silly. The AA is not good. The AA is by far the worst at this tier, and Leander's AA isn't any great shakes to start with, so you have just about half the overall DPS of Leander's AA. The inner envelope is actually even shorter ranged, and there's pretty much no point using AA skills. I mean, you can try, but you're not going to get that much benefit out of it. With manual AA and BFT, you will still not get quite the DPS that you would get from the Leander without any of those things. So don't bother specking for AA, it's rubbish. The torpedoes are basically the Leander's torps, 8 kilometers range, minute and a half reload, and you can have the single torp launches, so you do get that part of the Royal Navy flavour. And for this tier, these are actually pretty decent torps. You know, the range is okay, the firing arcs are okay, and the damage is actually pretty decent. I think only the Japanese cruisers get better damage torps at this tier. So yeah, don't discount the torps, especially if you get the chance to sneak up on somebody while you're in smoke, and hopefully with your hydro deployed or spotter or whatever. The fact that you can put out single launch torps means that you could potentially, you know, put 4 torps into somebody's nose, for instance. It does open up extra opportunities for ambushes. Speed 32.5 knots, turning radius 640 meters, so exactly identical to the Leander. It does have a very slightly better rudder response though. It's 7.6 seconds. Now, Leander and Perth are both pretty good for tier 6. They're not the best, but they're not that far off it. So yeah, 7.6 is alright. I think 7.6 is actually identical to the Nuremberg, but it's not so much the rudder response as it is the pretty good rudder response plus the best in class turn radius. I think only the Graf Spee, the Galissoniere and the Cleveland are really close. In fact, the Galissoniere is actually pretty good, but that's got a slightly worse rudder response. So yeah, 640 is nice and tight, and 7.6 is a pretty good response. So nothing to complain about there. And you're going to need that dodging capability in this ship, because it's a very fragile ship. You don't want to get hit by shells. Sometimes you'll catch a stray battleship shell anyway because RNG, but you know, if you're going to be squashy, you might as well be squashy and maneuverable. Lastly, camouflage, and it's actually the best in tier. It beats out Leander by a little bit. So you've got slightly worse range than Leander, but slightly better camouflage. And that's to the tune of about 200-ish meters. I say ish because we never know exactly with these. The client rounds it down to a single decimal place, and even the wiki sometimes does, but from the wiki at least some of the figures are in double digits. So if I actually click on my spreadsheet text box, it says 10.08 kilometers, so you know, rounding up to 10.1 there. So that puts it slightly better than the Leander, as I've said, and it makes it the best overall at tier 6, and everybody else is over 10 kilometers easily. I think the only other potentially kind of sneaky tier 6s, which aren't even really that close, are the Alba, which you can get down to a very best surface detection of 10.3, and the Nuremberg, which you can get down to 10.7. On the Duke of Doster is also 10.3 actually, potentially. But yeah, 8.6 is, as a best detection range, really very good. And basically the only things you could meet that will outspot you are destroyers. So if you're in a situation where it's you versus other cruisers or battleships, and you're able to be faster than them, which at 32.5 knots, you know, is not unreasonable that you would be, especially if you're running a Sierra Mike flag. Yeah, it's entirely possible for you to stop firing and break the engagement, but you might have to, you know, dodge for 20 seconds first. So the stealth is a real asset, and that will keep you alive, which is good, because as I've said, you have to be really quite cautious, even more so than Leander, because you don't have the heal. So that's that for the stats. Nothing too unexpected really. It's basically a Leander. It's squashy, it's stealthy, but it does get HE. So then we come to the consumables. So the smoke, as you are aware, is a very special kind of smoke. No other ship has this smoke. It is basically a creeping smoke screen. It's unlike regular smoke, where you just lay out the cloud and it's done. On Leander, not Leander, Perth, I'm going to be making that mistake a lot, I can feel it. On Perth, you continuously emit smoke for, by default, 90 seconds. This particular game, I've got the smoke mod on, so it's actually closer to 2 minutes. I also had the spotter plane mod on, so that is longer duration as well. There is a downside to this smoke though. I mean, it's very good for being on the assault or maybe trying to retreat away from lots of nasty things firing at you. But the downside is that whilst with regular smoke you lay it out and then let's say you've got an American smoke cloud that lasts for absolutely ages. All the time that you're in that smoke, of course, you're counting down towards your next smoke as well. But of course, Perth doesn't get that. The countdown to your next smoke only starts when your minute and a half or 2 minutes of smoke emission finishes. So you actually have a longer cooldown between the smokes. So you have to manage when and where to use those smokes quite carefully. And therefore, having Jack of all trades is especially desirable. Having those November Foxtrot flags, which give you the 5% less cooldown time on your consumables, is also very desirable. And as for going without the premium smoke, I don't know why you would even contemplate doing that. You want to do everything possible to get that duration down to your next smoke. Because you're so reliant on the smoke as well, it also makes Superintendent really a must-have skill. But on the whole, even though it does seem like a pretty big gimmick, it works. It really does actually work. And in this particular game, I mean, the last game, 68k damage, bottom tier, wasn't terrible. It was a very average kind of a game. It was nothing flashy or spectacular. In this particular game, this is me and Strangers123, and basically we're being a bit dirty. We're top tier, he's got a Leander, and we are going to be coordinating our smoke very, very carefully. And in this case, we're going to be using it to push a cap. Now, I've never yet seen in-game a division of 3 Leanders, not 3 Leanders, 3 Perths. I knew I'd be making that mistake. And I have absolutely no doubt that it would be fairly filthy. Not maybe as filthy as 3 Belfasts, but still quite filthy, because when you've got multiple ships, suddenly that smoke cooldown doesn't matter so much. And if you can coordinate and use each other's smoke, and another useful captain skill would actually be the one that gives you bigger smoke clouds, particularly for the Perth, so others can make use of it. Yeah, if you're coordinating, if you're matching speeds, if you're on voice comms, and so you can say when you're changing course and changing speed or whatever, then well, you'll be able to see exactly how effective it's going to be. So this is a bit more AP usage in this one because we're top tier and we've got broadside cruisers to use that. Strangers, of course, doesn't have any choice about what ammo he's using. But, I mean, between the two of us, actually, we've got sort of okay AA. His is not that good either, but it's certainly better than mine. There is one time where I do use the catapult fighter, actually, which I should maybe mention. Anytime I play operations with this, because it's a tier 6 ship, I always take the catapult fighter, because it's basically your primary AA defense. Your AA guns are pretty naff overall, and the spotter isn't that useful in operations, because generally speaking you're always going to be fairly close to the action. But for random games, you want to use the spotter 100% of the time, and having the spotter mod is extremely helpful. It's kind of like Warspite. You know, Warspite has not got a good range for tier 6 for a battleship, and so having that spotter is almost essential equipment. Whereas on a lot of battleships, if you have a spotter plane, it's, you know, it's something you pop out if you think there might be torpedoes in the water nearby, or if you want to spot somebody over an island, or, you know, you use it for spotting rather than actually getting the actual extra range. But in the case of Warspite, no, it is about the extra range, and that's definitely true for the Perth as well. So we got this cap. We're just, I think, coordinating fire on targets. As you can see, this poor Congo's managed to run himself aground. There's also a Koenig that's a little bit closer, but stationary target's always more tempting. Damage-wise, so far it's not been too bad. I don't have IFHE on this captain. It's only like a 12 or 13 point captain. I don't remember what captain skills I do actually have. I mean, this is one of those premiums where there are some very quite specific captain skills that you want that maybe don't necessarily match up with other ships, but because it's off on its own tree anyway, it doesn't really matter. And it is quite nice that if you get it from the super container, it comes with a 10-point captain, because otherwise you'd be having to basically train a captain from completely scratch, or else a 3-point captain if you're paying a little bit of money for it. But yeah, it's got a very particular play style, and in a way, even if you could put Royal Navy cruiser captains on it, it wouldn't be that useful, because the play style, the skills just don't really coincide. A Belfast captain might do, to be honest. A Belfast captain might be useful, because you'll be having the same sort of, IFHE, superintendent, concealment expert. That might broadly overlap, so maybe it's a pity that you can't do that, especially these days now that you can put ARP captains in Japanese ships and vice versa. So we're on a cooldown between smokes at the moment. We've decided to now pick on this New Mexico, who's also found an island. Their battleships were panicking a bit, it feels like, and just between myself and strangers. I mean, we've not done anything decisive yet, but I've got a kill. I don't think he has a kill yet, but he's certainly going to end the game with at least one. Yeah, we're just harassing the enemy at this point, and the fact that we have the smoke cover available to do so is really quite useful. But I think at this stage we were trying to get closer, because there is now really only this Koenig to shoot at, and using a smoke on just one ship when they're so evidently, not very long for this world, it would be a bit of a waste. You do have to pick and choose when to use the smokes quite carefully, because if you trigger one and then it turns out to be not that useful, which kind of happened in the last game, you then have to wait the entire cooldown for another smoke. Or else you can just be, I mean, even just for the duration, you can speed up, obviously, and you've got that almost 2 minutes with the smoke mod, where you are still emitting smoke, but it's not much use if you're having to go along at full speed. So the enemy team is now pushing down on the middle, and this presents some very nice opportunities for us in terms of using the combined smoke that we have, because we can be fairly static within that smoke, and we don't really even have any destroyers to worry about. The enemy team has one destroyer left. Our own team, well, we've lost about as many ships as they have, but there aren't any. Their carrier obviously is now out of commission, whereas ours is still in play, although it depends on whether they get caught by an enemy cruiser or not. Because it looks like there's what is that, Cleveland? It's a little hard to tell in the preview window sometimes, looking at the mini-map. But our focus is very much on this mid-cap, defending this mid-cap, and trying to do more damage, get more kills. So the advantage of this is that we don't have to sit in one spot, and that's actually a really big advantage for a Royal Navy type cruiser in smoke. I had a recent Leander game that I put up where I was able to use smoke reasonably effectively, but one of the big reasons why I was able to use it so effectively is that nobody was firing against me in that smoke. It's not that difficult, especially because the Royal Navy smoke clouds aren't that big. And especially at the higher tiers, when you get to the likes of the Neptune and the Minotaur, which are firing very rapidly indeed, if they're sat stationary, especially if they're sat broadside, it's really easy to range in on their position in the smoke. And you can end up, like, either they keep firing and giving their position away, or they have to stop firing in order to stealth up. And you can end up forcing somebody to essentially waste a smoke, because they then open fire because they know you're trying to hit them in said smoke. But the Perth doesn't have that, because you're continually moving, or you can potentially continually move. And so I found in practice, although I think in theory you could, if you were a good player, maybe learn to anticipate the rate of movement when you're going at 8 knots at quarter speed in the smoke. Players don't. They fire it where you were rather than where you're going. And although you're not getting the full benefit of how fast you could be going, which is what, 12 knots, 12 and a half knots, which, I mean, it's theoretically possible, but you have to do some really, really intensive throttle jockeying, if I can put it like that, to make sure that you're not going too fast, because half speed will get you visible. But yeah, even going at quarter speed, it is entirely possible to absolutely throw people's aim off. So that's my smoke down, and we're now in Strangers' static smoke cloud, and we're doing quite nicely for ourselves. I'm up to 73k already. I don't think I've had a huge number of fires, but 7's actually respectable. Okay, that's not too bad. And these enemy ships, well, because we have this big smoke cloud, and because the enemy destroyer is a Gnevny with really short-range torpedoes, we can basically sit here with more or less impunity unless they start trying to blind fire us. But the only person that was trying to blind fire us, I think we've actually killed at this point. So this is a pretty comfortable situation. One of the other advantages of smoke at this tier is that you don't see a lot of radar ships. So that's probably another thing I should mention. You know, there are some tier 7s with radar, and of course there are tier 8s with radar. But if you get to be top tier, or even in a tier 7 game, the chances of meeting a radar ship are pretty low. I mean, the best radar at tier 7 is by far the Indianapolis, but you don't see a lot of those. You really don't. So this Graf Spee is in serious trouble. The torps probably were unnecessary, but why not? It's not a particularly well aimed spread, even so, but never mind. He's down, and that's another kill for me. That's my 3rd, I believe. We're doing all right so far. I mean, we are ahead on points, but the enemy team does have that cap point, and although we have got some other ships backing us up, it kind of feels like myself and Strangers have been doing the lion's share of this particular game. But, you know, Strangers is a very good player. I like to think I'm not a completely terrible player, and just this combination, this ability to smoke each other up and do this over and over again, it absolutely is quite troll. And I've never seen or been in a triple Perth division, but I imagine it would be very, very troll, especially if all of them had the smoke mod. Maybe not as troll as triple Belfasts, but, you know, still quite troll. So there's just one ship left at this point, the Gnevny, and I like to think this is not a bad amount of damage for a tier 6 cruiser, considering we're top tier, and a lot of that's shared with Strangers as well. So it really does just come down to this, you know, is this Gnevny going to run? Is he going to try and get a last bit of damage? We don't know, but either way, myself and Strangers can go in and cap, and if he does run, then it'll shorten the remainder of the battle a bit. Our Bogue, I mean, we do still have a Bogue, but I think our Bogue might have been deplaned by this point, because he wasn't trying to air spot or anything. So yeah, I was just noticing that and thinking, there's not really any planes on the minimap, so they must have been deplaned. And that's always useful when you're trying to hunt down that last destroyer, if your carrier can task some planes to just keep them lit at all times. But in this case, I guess they couldn't. So we've pushed up. The Kirov is here as well, although he's very low health. So you know, obviously the Gnevny, having chosen to make a fight of it, to go down swinging, has actually managed to pick themselves up a final kill. But the end is reasonably nigh. He's not going to last too much longer. It's just going to be which of us is going to get to kill him. So obviously it's not going to be that salvo. Strangers doesn't get a particularly good spread with that one. Maybe this one will be the one that finishes it. And there it is. So that was the final kill for me. 4 kills. No Kraken, sadly, but still it wasn't a bad result. 86,000 damage done. And a pretty reasonable amount of XP. This wasn't actually the best Perth XP result or damage result I have. I think I've got a 100k loss somewhere. I also had a 96k loss which was actually in a division with Arun. But in the end, I decided, in the interests of brevity, that I would not include those particular games and just use these two. Because, you know, the first one was a pretty average game. Well, I say average, it was probably better than average, but it was a pretty decent game, and it wasn't flashy, it wasn't anything special. This one was kind of troll. It was me and strangers really kind of dominating things with our coordinated use of smoke. And the fact that the Perth smoke allows you to be mobile, it doesn't tie you down like Leander smoke does. That's the big advantage of the Perth. That's why, even though it's a gimmick ship, it's 100% a gimmick ship, it's actually a pretty good gimmick. And it works rather well. So if you get a Perth from a super container, don't immediately dismiss it. With the right captain skills, with the right mods, if you have them, you can make this a very, very powerful little ship. And it can do well even in high tier battles, just because it has that creeping smoke. And it just goes to show that this versus the Leander, what a difference it can make, just even having a different set of consumables available. Yes, you have to be more careful because you don't have the heal, but you've got that smoke, and I think that more than makes up for it. Sometimes we rail against gimmick ships, but other times the gimmick ships work quite well. It's just it's quite easy to mess it up. But in the case of the Perth, it does actually work. It is actually a fun ship to play, and by itself it's not overpowered, but a triple division of them might well be. Anyway, I've never yet seen that. I kind of dread the day when I see it on the enemy team, 3 Perths. That will be a sight to behold, potentially. Or not, because it will just be smoke. Constant smoke. Anyway, so that's the Perth. If it comes on sale at some point, I can recommend it as a fun tier 6 ship. If you get it in a super container, well, be glad, because it's one of the better ships you can get from a super container, and it is quite a nice ship to play. So hopefully you found this review useful, and if you did, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.